And so you may have seen something similar to this slide the last few weeks with Mitch Stevenson a few weeks ago and Jerry Valesky last week, but a lot of planning for drought occurs well before the drought occurs. And so your grazing management, your grazing plan really can dictate what is that nutritional management or that strategy that we have, and what's that contingency plan. So within that grazing plan that you develop every year, you really need to think about what is that contingency plan of dealing with drought, or these occurrences that may crop up during that year that may change some of your management strategy. So I believe Mitch Stevenson talked about trigger points and using some of the rainfall data that we have here at Goodmanson or up at Barta Brothers, and thinking about, what's that timing of those effective rainfall time events that really has a big influence on majority of our forage production. And so within that contingency plan of those trigger points of not only that rainfall, that precip, it's really effective precip, is think about cow condition as another trigger point. Is a lot of times we fall into those cases when we keep on doing a management strategy the same way every year. We have feeding dates that we always intervene or come in at, December 1, we start feeding. A few years ago, I was dealing with a ranch that fell into a big wreck when we got really cold, get really wet. That fell into that they start feeding December 1, and their cows were way far behind by then, and it got really wet, got really cold, and they got in a pretty good wreck because of it. And so watching those trigger points and using those trigger points as body condition score as a time point to intervening and being very strategic about it. Another part of that contingency plan is your surplus feedstuffs. What do you have available? What do you have on hand? One thing I do with Goodmanson is I keep a year supply of hay on hand. So every year we put up hay. About this time each year we go through what's hay do we have left from going through the winter, and start thinking about what's available, what we need in case we get into a drought. We also have some other management strategies with yearlings to help relieve and increase that or decrease that grazing pressure if we fall into a dry spell like we did last year. And I believe a few weeks ago, we had a producer talk about using their yearlings in that model of a flexible grazing strategy. And that's really effective way to dealing with those precips or the not getting that rainfall and having some of these periods or years of dry spells. So we always want to take this, assess this current situation, where we're at with our cows, our body condition score, what's our age of our cows. And some of this is important when you think about if I need to sell some cows. Drought's a good time to reassess of what kind of cows do I have, and do those cows fit my management strategy? And can I relieve some grazing pressure by getting rid of some of these bottom feeding cows that are not quite as good as the rest, or they don't quite fit my operation? Physiological stage is important, and we'll talk about some requirements, why that's important when we think about moving into breeding season, getting cows pregnant, and what kind of strategy we have around that can help with the drought situations. A big one is knowing what's the quality and quantity of forage we have. A producer called me a few weeks ago that mentioned that his hay is always 10% crude protein. So I asked him, said, did you run a test on it this year? And his response was yes. When they pulled the analysis, their hay was 4% crude protein. That totally changed my strategy, or the strategy we had to feed their cows through calving. Is there's a massive difference between that 10 and that 4. And knowing that can really help you within that supplementation strategy. And the last part of that is knowing your hay inventory or that feedstuff inventory, whether or not it's corn silage. For a lot of people, I've got a lot of producers that fed their way through the winter with not having a lot of forage and a lot of forage available, fed their way through with corn silage. The side effect of that for them is their cows are overconditioned. And so we're dealing with cows that may be too great of a body condition score, and we may have to deal with some cows losing a lot of body weight going into breeding because of having cows in body condition score 6, 7s and breeding seasons in July. And so that's something that you have to think about is where's my body condition score? What's the direction we're going, and what quality of feedstuffs do I have available? So why is body condition score important? And everyone should have seen something like this or have heard people talking about this, but that calving body condition score is closely related to reproductive success. It's closely related to calf immune function. And so cows that are thinner at body or calving could have calves that have lower immune function later on in life, and that could be a long-term impact. But that current body condition score is the impact of that balance of nutrient supply and her requirements. And so it's what happened here in the past that's a result of her current body condition score situation. And it could be a mismatch of cow genetic potential and the forage. And so we could be having too high of forage quality and too low of genetic potential. We could have too high of genetic potential and too low of forage quality. So we could have offsetting ends of that we really need to pay attention to moving forward. So a couple things come to mind when I think about drought management to meet cow requirements is one, to provide supplemental feed to ensure the cow herd has adequate protein, energy, minerals, etc. Right? And the second thing is that, can I reduce nutrient requirements of the cows? And so we've got two options going through this, is that either we can provide additional supplementation, whether or not it's protein, it's energy, or do I need to reduce that nutrient requirement of that cow? And that's actually early weaning and decreasing that lactational requirement of that cow. And we'll talk about that later. And there's quite a few producers in the Sandhills, or the southern part of Sandhills, actually early wean and pretty effective at it. And this may be an option for a lot of producers if cow condition starts being a problem and don't have some of those feedstuffs to offset the low quality forage or maybe the limited forage. When we think about requirements, and so this is a net energy requirement for a 1,200 pound March calving cow with 23 pounds of milk at peak milk production. So think about peak milk production occurs about 60 days after calving. And so her highest requirements occur about 60 days after calving. The next thing right after that happens is we're moving right into breeding season. And so we've really coupled her highest peak requirements with trying to get a cow to recover from calving and move into that breeding season. And then that energy requirement starts decreasing down to about weaning time. When we pull that calf off, wean that cow, that's our lowest energy and actually protein requirement of that cow. And it starts picking up again during that late part of gestation due to that fetal growth during late gestation. And so our highest 2 points of nutrient requirements is that early lactation time point and that late lactation time point. And so those are very important when we think about our timing at calving and where's our nutrients. What's our quality of nutrients over those time spans? And make sure we're not limiting nutrients in either one of these time points that could have an impact not only on that cow's performance, but also that offspring further down the line. So when you think about forage quality, it's really the ultimate measure of animal performance. And so when we look at animal performance year in and year out, and this is much easier from a yearling or growing model, but that performance really tells me what that forage quality was. And so that's determined, or that animal performance is determined by feed availability, what's the content of that, the intake of that forage, because we can have some really high quality forages available, but if cow won't eat it, that doesn't matter. The extent of digestion and metabolism of that feed digested, but availability intake most often determine that animal performance. And so, are that forage quality is really controlling animal performance for our cows, and understanding where we're at with forage quality or whatever feed stuff we're feeding is very important to make sure we're meeting our goals for animal performance. So this gives you a little proxy or understanding of the interaction of rainfall and precip to crude protein or just forage quality. We'll use crude protein here as a proxy for forage quality. And so we've got 3 different years of average year at Goodmanson, the drought in 2002, and then that really wet year we had a few years ago in 2018. If you look at crude protein in June across these, that drought and that average year was pretty equal. That wet year, we had much lower crude protein. So that forage quality in June was much lower than a drought year. And the big reason for that is, if you think about rainfall, either high rainfall or in a drought situation, that influences forage growth. In a low rainfall situation, it does not allow that forage to mature at a faster rate. So it stays immature a little bit longer. So forage quality early on in a drought actually stays a little higher quality. In that wet year, there's so much rainfall that forage quality really grows. It matures very fast, and it gets to be a low quality situation much faster than a lot of times in a drought situation. So wet years can actually mimic, from a quality aspect, a drought year. And this got a lot of people in trouble in 2018, thinking, we had a wet, good year, but performance was low. Guys were weaning 50 pounds less of a calf, or seeing yearlings not grow as much during that summer grazing period. If we look at July, that's when we start seeing that dip in that drought year. It's very similar, we're getting similar to that wet 2018 year, and so forth down to September, October. And so that rainfall can really influence not only forage production, but forage quality. And so for most part in dry years or drought years, outside of earlier on, drought really influences crude protein. And so crude protein is going to be one of the things we're going to really pay attention to in a lot of our supplementation strategies, due to knowing it's probably going to be lower than usual. And there's some other avenues or issues that we're going to have for crude protein, or having limited crude protein. We'll get there in a second. This gives you an illustration of forage intake needed to meet protein requirements for pregnancy and milk. And so since we're calving or going through calving and into early lactation, we'll just look at these lactation curves over here. And since there's very few, actually 10 pounds of milk cow or beef cow that milks 10 pounds in the United States today, let's just focus on this cow that's 20 pounds of milk per day at peak lactation. If we look from forage quality at 12%, 8% in red, and 4% in green, as that forage quality declines, her ability to consume enough to meet her requirement will decline. And so she's got to eat more and more of that forage to meet her requirement. And so let's say this is a 1,200 pound cow who has the capacity under this circumstance to probably eat somewhere around 25 pounds of forage on a dry matter basis. And to meet her requirement at 12%, she's consuming about 20 pounds. So she's going to meet those crude protein requirements at that 12%. We moved to 8% crude protein. Now she's about 30 pounds of forage. And so she's just shy of meeting her requirements at that 8%. When we dip down to 4%, she's got to eat 60 pounds. So this cow can only eat about 25 pounds of forage. And to meet her requirements, she's got to eat 60. And this is where we run into a lot of cow performance issues in drought years, or even in those wet years, of why we see low pregnancy rates in cows, especially in a lot of our summer calving herds that start calving in May and June, is because of where our forage quality is and their ability to consume enough of that forage to actually meet their requirements. This is just another illustration of the impact that forage quality has on percent of body, forage intake as a percent of body weight. And so there's always this old adage that once forage quality gets below about 7%, by providing a protein supplement, we're going to see an increase in forage intake. And so that 7% is usually kind of that marker of knowing that if I feed a protein supplement, I'm going to see a benefit in forage intake. And it's really feeding those microbes. Feeding those microbes in the rumen will help digest that forage. And, you know, as that lower quality forage stays in the rumen longer, they can eat less. So you've got some gut feel issues with forage quality getting lower than this 8% here. And so, you know, what we see a lot of this happen in the summer months in drought conditions, that forage quality hovers around that 7 to 8% much earlier on. In 2018, our forage quality in July looked like October, you know, and we're turning bulls out in July with October forage quality. And that's one reason why we really see that decline in performance, is that forage quality and inability to eat enough of that forage to actually meet their requirements. This is an older review paper on the improvement of forage intake by supplementing protein. And so if we fed the same amount of protein here across these, if the supplement was less than 15% crude protein, 15 to 20, 20 to 30, or greater than 30% crude protein, we see an increase in forage intake. And so the lower the percent of protein in that diet that we're supplying, the less of an advantage or improvement we have over an unsupplemented group. And so, you know, this comes up a lot, especially with guys with distillers, is thinking distillers, since it's an energy feed, or it can be an energy feed, that I can stretch forage. I had a guy call me the other day thinking, you know, can I stretch my forage by feeding distillers? If we look at where distillers is 28 to about 32% crude protein, we're somewhere around that 44% increase in forage intake. And so by feeding a protein supplement, that's, you know, somewhere in that 25 to 30+% crude protein, we're not going to stretch our forage. We're actually going to get a better utilization of that forage and increase the energy intake of that forage versus trying to stretch it or decrease intake. So that's very important to think about, is what type of supplement we have. If we're trying to stretch that forage, these higher protein supplements will not do it. They're actually increasing intake of that forage and utilization of that forage. So if we think about expected responses from protein supplementation, we will see an increase in digestibility of that forage. We're going to see increased forage intake. Probably going to see an increased energy intake, because once we increase digestibility and forage intake, we're going to see an increase in energy intake overall. And that's why we can maintain or at least increase body weight in some of these scenarios. And so think about, you know, if we move into a drought condition of having lower quality forages, you know, protein may be our first limiting nutrient in those situations. But it really depends on, do I have forage available, or how much forage available do I have? And it somewhat depends on what's that body condition score of that cow. So this was an older study done, one of Don Clatton's grad students did several years back in the late 1980s, but feeding steers consuming a low quality mature forage, it was about 5.2% crude protein with soybean meal. So soybean meal is a high crude protein supplement. And just look at the increase in dry matter intake of that forage versus no supplement in that soybean meal. So no supplement was at 10.7. Soybean meal increased that intake of that forage to 18.4. So it's a 72% increase in forage intake by feeding, looks like about 1.5 pounds of soybean meal. All right, so if we're trying to stretch forage, feeding protein is not going to do it. It will increase that energy intake and increase that forage intake, which could be a good thing if forage is not limiting. If we have enough forage, we have enough hay, and it's lower quality, then protein is going to have a positive impact. If we look at TDN intake or that energy intake of that forage, we went from 4.2 to about 8.5. And so basically doubled that energy intake by feeding of that hay, by feeding that 1.5 pounds of soybean meal, right? So protein supplements will increase intake and they'll increase energy intake of those cows. So situations where we have plenty of forage or plenty of low quality forage, feeding a protein supplement can increase that utilization and increase the energy intake of those cows. So what if my forage is in short supply? So if we progress into a drought situation and maybe our forage is short, we don't have enough forage for our cows, or we don't have enough hay, what can we do? One thing I highly recommend in almost all supplements I feed to cows is adding an ionophore. In this slide, we're talking about Rumensin, but ionophores will help with forage intake and actually decrease forage intake. This was an older study from NDSU that looked at feeding Rumensin into a protein supplement versus a control group that just got the protein supplement during late gestation. All right, for about it was roughly 120 days during that time frame. Adding that small amount of Rumensin actually increased body weight gain by nearly 25 pounds. I've got data here from Goodmanson that by the same supplement with and without Rumensin, we increased late gestation body weight gains by 50 pounds. And so adding Rumensin to the diet can really help with that energy efficiency, that gain of that animal. But one thing it did is it decreased dry matter intake by about 6%. And so a small amount of Rumensin will really help decrease that forage intake. In this study, they had about a $13 cost savings by adding Rumensin to their diet. And that was just through that forage intake and decreasing forage intake. Over the years, there's been numerous studies that found anywhere from about 6 to 20% decrease in forage intake by adding Rumensin. You will increase cost savings due to cost of hay, cost of forage, etc. And you can see a slight increase in body weight gain or some kind of energy efficiency by having that Rumensin in the diet. And so most supplements I do, we generally add Rumensin to it. During these drought situations, I think that's pretty important to think about is how can I add Rumensin to some of my supplementation strategies. Another benefit of ionophores, this is 5 different studies that fed ionophores during early lactation before breeding. And almost every one of them decreased that postpartum interval. So that time frame from calving until cows start cycling again. And so that's pretty important from the aspect of, getting those cows recovered from calving, start cycling and go into that breeding season and try and get them bred as early as possible. And that can be tough during a drought situation. And so across these 5 different studies, actually decreased postpartum interval about 18 days. So think about what that does in a 60 or 45 day breeding season that, we've got these cows cycling about almost a full cycle ahead than they would have previously.
Hey, Travis, John has a question regarding that Rumensin study. Was that with non-lactating cows? And was there any work on corn stalk grazing as well with Rumensin?
Yeah, so that was with cows during late gestation. If we're talking, John, if we're talking about this study here, that was with cows during late gestation. And so there's probably has been plenty of studies of grazing corn stalks with Rumensin, or there's probably plenty of producers that have Rumensin in mineral and have cows on corn stalks. But from a forage intake or a stock intake, yeah, I don't know any that actually would show that difference. But you should still see a decrease in utilization or decrease in forage intake, increase in utilization by having Rumensin with cows on corn stalks.
Is there any difference if you use, well, a phosphorus mineral?
In terms of forage intake?
Yes.
Probably not.
Does a cow that's short of phos, is that give her a ravenous appetite?
I would say no. And so, you know, the mineral data is unclear on a lot of things because it's hard to get clear mineral data. But I would say, you know, especially from the aspect of, it's hard to actually, for us to get intake data as well. And so I would say probably not, John.
Okay.
All right. And so the other benefit that I highly suggest ionophores outside of feed intake and some efficiency data is the effect it has on reproduction. So you think about, you know, going through this drought, if we're dry going into the breeding season, you know, having ionophore part of that supplementation plan is pretty important. Another thing that's pretty common in a lot of areas in Nebraska is using wet distillers in low quality hay. And so this is the evidence when guys want to talk about using distillers to limit forage intake. This is where I go with it, is if you're near a ethanol plant and I can get wet distillers, utilizing with a low quality hay. And a lot of times in drought situations, good high quality hay is hard to find. You may find a lot of low quality stock hay, wheat straw hay, etc. And this is wheat straw hay in this study here that was done at Goodmanson a few years back. But a combination of wet distillers in low quality hay can really help stretch that forage. And so in this study, they have four different treatments, a control that didn't get any, 70-30 on a dry matter basis. This graph down here to actually tell you what was fed on a as fed basis on wheat straw and wet distillers in these ratios, and 60-40 and a 50-50. And they fed these to at an estimated, what's 50% of their estimated dry matter intake. And so, which is about 12.5 is what they fed in the study. And the 60-40 and the 50-50 mix decreased forage displacement by about 35%. The 70-30 that had an increase in wheat straw here, actually about 50% of forage intake was displaced or replaced with that supplement. If you look at performance of these cows this is lactating cows with a calf on their side, look at performance, all beat the control that lost some body weight. As you expect, at this much higher wet distiller rate had the highest average daily gain. So in the situation that we may want cows to slightly gain or maintain body weight, you know, this higher low quality hay distillers was pretty effective and actually had a higher replacement of forage than the other. So that's an option for a lot of producers that have the capacity to bag hay and wet distillers or have wet distillers that's pretty easily to get to. Another thing that's talked about a lot, especially in drought situation, is ammoniating low quality hay. And that could be corn stalks, could be wheat straw. And so it gets brought up quite a bit in drought situations. And so the big benefit of ammoniating low quality hay is taking something that's really low quality. You can take like this wheat straw that's 3.7 crude protein, and less than 40% TDN or energy value. Ammoniating bumps it up to 9.7 and 48%. And so we can buy some of these really cheap, low quality hays, ammoniate them at a pretty low cost. It'd actually be lower cost than the combination of is lower cost and sometimes than buying the hay and a protein supplement, and get a pretty decent feed out of it that will help stretch that forage. In some of these scenarios, these wheat straw scenario here, there may need to be some added energy fed to this supplement to meet, especially a lactating cow's energy requirement. But some of these are fairly comparable to actually feeding a quality alfalfa hay, especially this Milo stover and this prairie hay. You get to a moderate or a high quality forage, you do not want to ammoniate. And so you can have some toxicity issues, or a wet hay, you can have some toxicity issues. But with a low quality forage that's somewhere in this below 7% crude protein range, we can really take something that's cheap and make a fairly high to moderate quality forage to help replace some of that forage or be a quality feed stuff. Another thing that's talked about quite a bit is substitution and using energy or a starch. And so using corn or a starch feed is a catch-22 situation. And so, we're increasing the energy feed that we're feeding. But one thing it can do is, it can limit feed intake or forage intake, but also can decrease digestibility of it. So that's the catch-22 situation is I can decrease intake, but I'm also decreasing forage digestibility. So energy intake sometimes is much lower by feeding corn in some of these situations, and we'll cover where that may be. And some of these lower 0.2% of body weight, so if we're like a 1,200 pound cow, that's roughly 2 pounds of corn. So feeding roughly 2 pounds of corn here, we actually see a slight increase in digestibility of that forage. And so you do get some rumen synergy of utilizing forage quality or that forage by some of these lower energy. Once we get up to about 0.4, 0.5, we'll start decreasing that digestibility of it. We'll decrease forage intake, but overall our energy consumption may decline because of that. Here's another good example of what feeding corn can do to not only hay intake, but energy intake. And so in a low quality situation that we may be faced with in a drought, if I go out and feed corn, this hay was a 5-6% crude protein hay in the study with yearlings. Feeding 2.2 pounds of hay to yearlings slightly decreased hay intake. 4.4 kind of dropped about 4 or 5 pounds. So that's about a 1-to-1 replacement rate at that point. All right, so 4 pounds of corn replaced about 4 pounds of that hay. And then 6.6, again, nearly that 1-to-1 ratio of 6 pounds of corn replaced about 6 pounds of hay. We look at energy intake, we do get a boost in energy intake with 2 pounds, similar to that digestibility slide earlier, but energy intake actually declines after that. And so that's really due to the digestibility and some of that substitution. And so it's very important when we think about feeding a starch that we're meeting those protein requirements to actually utilize that starch and that hay and not have such a drastic decrease in digestibility of that forage, causing this decline in energy intake. A good example of this is a study that Don Clatton's student did back in the late 1980s, 1990s, that fed cows during late gestation a low quality hay. They were fed air corn plus protein or protein alone. And so during that winter late gestation time frame, just feeding corn at low quality, those cows lost about 120 pounds. Air corn plus protein lost about 40 pounds, and protein alone gained 13 pounds. And so in these low quality situations, we've got to meet their protein requirements first. If we're not meeting their protein requirements, feeding a starch can really decrease overall energy consumption, and you may not get the performance you're looking for. All right. So from an energy supplementation, 1 to 2 pounds per day will encourage intake. It'll actually encourage digestibility, energy intake overall. 3 to 5 pounds of starch decreases total forage consumption. It can increase energy intake if protein requirements are met. So generally, I think about having a hay or a forage quality somewhere around 10% or greater in that situation. So I get less than that, I start running issues that protein is limiting, and my energy intake could be lower at that point and cause some of those negative responses to starch, where that energy status may not be improved at that point. This is a daily feeding situation. All right, so when I come in with a starch or feed a starch as a energy, that is a daily feeding situation. If I'm looking at digestible fiber, let's take Distillers grains, soy hulls, wheat mids, something around that corn gluten feed. 3 to 5 pounds actually can decrease total forage consumption slightly, and some of that is just due to that fill. You can increase total energy intake, and you can feed that in an alternate day scenario and still get that benefit of that energy from that fiber. And so that's a little different from that starch-based energy supplementation. Won't touch on it. Carla Wilkie talked about limit feeding in a confinement a few weeks ago. And so if you're interested in moving from, think about the situation as I'm limited in forage, I'm limited in what I can do is, can I put cows in a confinement situation to limit feed them? And Carla did a good job covering a lot of the research that's been going on and how to utilize that as a drought management strategy. And so if this is something that you're interested in or fits your management, I suggest going back and pulling up Carla's presentation on limit feeding cows in confinement as a drought management strategy. Another thing to look at from to stretch forage resources is alfalfa hay. And so I've got a lot of producers that utilize this method a lot. And so in this study here, they fed alfalfa hay at 0.2, 0.4, 0.7, up to about 1% of the body weight. And they looked at percent of body weight of forage intake from those resulting different amounts of alfalfa hay that's been fed. As alfalfa diet per day increase, that forage intake decreases. And we think a lot about alfalfa as a protein or using alfalfa as a protein supplement, but feeding at a larger amount or even feeding at 2 or 3 pounds, you still have some substitution effect. You still have some effect of that fill of feeding that hay has on replacement of forages. And so I've got a lot of guys that were feeding full days, about 2% of their body weight in alfalfa every other day in scenarios where, that one day and the next day, they really don't, that one day, they really don't graze much at all. And so you still get that benefit of that protein following after that, and use it to help really stretch that forage as using as a hay, as a fiber source, that degradable fiber source. So one thing to really touch on here is if we're in a hay feeding situation, a lot of times we fall into waste. And so if hay is limited, we've really got to look at how we're feeding that hay to really decrease the waste of that hay. And so free choice hay situation is going to have really high waste. If you think about, if I have a 25% waste of that hay, I'm basically giving away one every 4 bales of hay, or I'm wasting one every 4 bales of hay. So if hay is limited, I really want to decrease that waste. And the type of feeder that I'm using can really influence waste. And there's a lot of information out from Extension on, you know, the type of feeder, on the amount of waste there is. Another option you have is if I've got a bunch of cows in a dry lot pen and have them sit with a bale of hay, they're going to overeat. Consumption in that dry lot with a bale of hay is higher. During calving season, what I estimate cows eating in our dry lot is much lower than what we're actually feeding. And that's with a pretty good waste estimate on top of that. Is cows sitting there will eat more than their requirements, or they normally would, because they're just sitting on top of the hay. And so there's been quite a few studies looked at limit feeding hay, meaning, you know, pulling those cows in, let them eat for 6 to 12 hours, pulling them out. And that way you can really help decrease that utilization of that hay and decrease that waste or over consuming hay. Another thing you could do, and it really, if you have the amount of cows to do it, you know, unrolling your hay on the ground is pretty effective at decreasing that waste. Instead of using a feeder, it's only effective if I can unroll the amount for 1 day's consumption, right? And so it's really dependent on number of cows I'm feeding. But that's another avenue. Instead of using a feeder, which a lot of guys do in a dry lot situation, is how can I unroll bales and decrease that waste? Another avenue, or one of the last avenues I want to talk about, is early weaning. And so I've got a lot of guys that early wean on a normal basis in some of the southern part of the Sandhills. So they usually wean for about 90 to 120 days after calving. And the benefit in this situation is now I'm decreasing nutrient requirements of that cow. It's roughly about 35% of those requirements. And so, you know, during a drought situation, we either can feed our way through it, or we can decrease our requirements. And early weaning is one of those ways that I can decrease those requirements of the cows. The problem we run into for a lot of guys is what to do with those calves. I've got to have some high quality feed stuff available, or I'm selling these calves that are very lightweight. I've got to have a higher quality substance there that I can feed those calves to get adequate gains. And so we kind of shift our costs from feeding those cows through that drought period to feeding those calves through that drought period. And depending on where you're at and what feed stuff you have, you know, that could be a pretty good option of, let's pull those calves off at 90 to 100 days. And 90 to 100 days is moving into that breeding season, which is important, especially for young females. And I'll show you some data here shortly. But that could be a very effective way to deal with this drought, is early weaning and weaning those cows off those cows. And so this was some data from Goodmanson in the early 90s that looked at forage intake of a cow-calf pair in July, September, and then July the following year. On a dry matter basis, that pair is eating 30 to 32 pounds of forage per day. And so that's a lot of forage that's tied up in that calf. A calf's consuming 4 to 6 pounds of forage. And then you've got the added increase in intake due to lactation. And so that's quite a bit of forage that's consuming in that pair, that if I can take that calf out of that scenario, if forage is limited, can I help preserve or stretch that forage? And actually, if it's a little lower quality, her requirements are lowering at that time point, and it may be easier to get cows pregnant then. So on average, and this is just an average number that we put out, is when I wean that cow off of that calf, I save about 10 pounds of forage. And so it's about a 10-pound saving. And so 10 pounds of forage equals somewhere around 0.4 days of grazing for a dry cow that's not lactating. So think about a pretty effective way to stretch forage is using weaning as that strategy. And that's only if I have a place to put these calves. So this was some data out of Oklahoma State by Keith Lusby back in 1981 that looked at early weaning young and extremely thin cows. So if we fall in the scenario that cows are thin, I can do something with the calves. So they weaned in the study, they weaned these young cows 6 to 8 weeks. And so, 6 to 8 weeks, we're at peak lactation with these cows. We're moving into getting close to that breeding season. And so at the end of the study, they had that normal wean group and they have an early wean group. And so conception rate in the normal wean was 59. Conception rate was 97 in the early wean. And so we don't see this big response in preg rate in early wean and mature cows. We generally see very little or a small increase in preg rate by early wean and mature cows. But in young females, this has a big response. Is you take that calf off, you take those nutrient, that demand of lactation, and you allow those nutrients now to go to support reproduction function and getting that cow to actually gain some body weight prior to breeding. And so if you looked at cow body weight at normal weaning time, there's about 87 pounds difference between the two. Big difference in cyclicity at 85. Think about, I've got to get a cow pregnant by 85 to 90 days post-calving. And so in this study, 90% of cows are cycling by that time point, 34% are cycling at day 85. So the ones that get pregnant here, either get pregnant earlier or they're going to get strung out. And so you're going to have some long-term issues by stringing some of these younger females out and getting them bred later. And very little difference in calf weaning weight between these two scenarios. And so that's a really good option, especially in young females, is if I've got a place to put these calves, look at early weaning these younger females. And the big response, the big economic response is this, is that reproduction response, is it allows these young females to be reproductively competent and get pregnant in timely fashion. So drought planning, early planning gives more flexibility. If I'm behind the ball, it's hard to move through drought. If I don't have the available feedstuffs, or if I didn't have a plan to get through this, I may be in trouble when drought occurs. And so that drought planning is in that annual contingency plan that I build. Encompasses my grazing management, what's my carryover or surplus of feedstuffs, what's my trigger points, and when do I need to intervene? And if I have to have a reduction plan, what is that reduction plan? So with that, Casey, I'll gladly take any questions.
Perfect. Do we have any questions? I know we had a couple clarification questions in the chat.